Welcome everyone who's joining. We're going to give folks another minute or so to finish logging on, and then we'll get started with our webinar. Welcome everyone to our webinar, Developing Culturally Responsive Approaches to Serving Diverse Populations. This webinar is part of our efforts at the National Research Center on Hispanic Children and Families to build capacity in the field to better serve Latino communities throughout our country. And as a note, we are hosting today's webinar during Hispanic Heritage Month, a time to honor the contributions Latinos have made in the United States. While we generally developed the webinar with a focus on Latino children and families, the content here we hope that you will find is applicable to other populations. And with that, I'm going to go over just a few logistics. Throughout the presentation, if you have any technical questions, please submit them using the question box on your side panel. You'll see the box on the right-hand side of your screen where you can easily submit questions to our team, and we'll get right back to you. This is the same place where you can submit questions to our panelists at any time during the presentation. And we'll queue the questions up and present them once the panel discussion is over. If we're not able to address your questions during the webinar, we'll email them to you directly. Also, throughout the webinar, we'll be live tweeting, so please feel free to tweet and follow our Twitter chat. You can follow us at NRC Hispanic and follow the Twitter chat using hashtag NRC Hispanic. So we have a number of speakers, so let me just take a moment to introduce them. First up is myself, Lina Guzman. I'm the director of Child Trends Hispanic Institute and the co-principal investigator of the National Research Center on Hispanic Children and Families. And next up is Jennifer Amaya Thompson. Ms. Amaya Thompson is a program specialist for culturally and linguistically responsive practices within the Administration for Children and Families, which is housed within the Department of Health and Human Services. She's going to be providing a brief overview on the Administration for Children and Families efforts in this area. Mike Lopez, a principal investigator, a principal associate at APT Associates, and also co-PI of the center, will be providing an overview of the guide on which this webinar is based. And after the overview of the guide, we'll begin the panel portion of our webinar, which will be moderated by Mike. And so joining to provide perspectives from a program, technical and training assistance, and legislative points of view to develop culturally responsive approaches are Suzanne Orozco, the Executive Director of Telemon Corporation. Suzanne has a 30-year track record of Head Start and nonprofit management, and she's committed to Telemon's mission to providing educational services that lead to better jobs, lives, and communities. Dr. Deborah Maceo serves as a coordinator of cultural and linguistic practices for the National Center on Early Childhood Development, Teaching, and Learning, which is part of 0 to 3. And if you might have noticed, us in DC, we like to have very long titles to our organizations and our work titles. The primary focus of her work is to ensure that the center's resources authentically and respectfully reflect the populations that they serve. And last is Dr. Matthew Wire, who's a senior policy specialist with the National Conference of State Legislators. Dr. Wire's work centers on enhancing equity and access for young disadvantaged populations in order to ensure that all students are ready and successful. So just a few words about the National Research Center on Hispanic Children and Families. We were founded in 2013 through a grant from the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation within the Department of Health and Human Services. The center's mission is to conduct research and provide research-based information to help inform programs and policies supporting Hispanic families and children around 3 programmatic areas of interest to OPRE. First, poverty and self-sufficiency, healthy marriage and responsible fatherhood, and early care and education. And because we aim to inform programs and policies, our research focuses on low-income Hispanics. In addition to research, we fulfill this mission through building capacity activities, such as this webinar that we're having today, and also through strategic dissemination and outreach efforts, making sure that the research we do gets into the hands of those who can use it. And the center represents a unique partnership between research and academic institutions, organizations, including Caltrans and Abt Associates, as well as 3 universities, NYU, University of Maryland, and the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, as well as our federal partner, OPRE. And just a quick note that the views expressed here represent those of the center and not those of the federal government. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer, who's going to be speaking to ACF efforts in this area. Jennifer?
Thank you, Lina. Good afternoon. Buenas tardes, everyone. I'm excited to be part of this webinar and provide you with remarks from the Administration of Children and Families and its ongoing efforts and commitments to support diversity in serving children, families, and communities. ACF's mission and history emphasizes promoting the social and the economic well-being of all individuals, families, and communities, especially the most vulnerable and underrepresented in the United States population. In the past several years, ACF's strong commitments to promoting equity and access to social services has led to strengthening internal and external awareness and capacity to support cultural and linguistic responsiveness. Briefly, I would like to highlight for you some recent key examples of ACF efforts to support culturally and responsive approaches to serving diverse populations. In 2016, ACF launched a webinar series entitled Enhancing the Cultural Responsiveness of Social Services. The purpose of this webinar was to expand the understanding of what it means to be culturally responsive and to encourage discussions about potential strategies to enhance cultural awareness and acknowledge the skills development and organizational supports for more cultural and linguistic responsive services. We also have the central and regional staff that has formed task force groups around equity, inclusiveness, Hispanic outreach, and racial equity as well. ACF has participating in training on unconscious biases and have piloted intensive trainings and tools to view their work through racial equity and diversity lens, with a goal of both strengthening our internal attention to racial issues and informing our external work. Individual program officers are carrying out this work in various ways with their staff among and through different various relevant initiatives in the program areas. For example, the Program Resources Guide being presented today was developed through the collaboration of the National Research Center on Hispanic Children and Families and the ACS Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation, along with several other resources developed to support local and state agencies in utilizing data and research to enhance the cultural response of other services. Another great example that I'm so proud to speak to you about is the work of the Office of Early Childhood Development, which oversees the Office of Head Start and the Office of Child Care under the Division of Comprehensive Services and Training and Technical Assistance. About a year ago, the Equity, Inclusiveness, and Culturally and Linguistic Responsive Work Group was created to ensure that all products developed through the National Center for Training and Technical Assistance integrated cultural linguistic practices to serve the diverse populations at the state and the local level. Once again, I want to thank you for the opportunity to share with you some of the great efforts that ACF continues to do, strengthening our internal capacity and informing our external work through promoting the social, economic well-being of all individuals, families, and communities. And Mike, I think you are going after me, correct?
Yes. Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, Lena. I'd like to turn our attention to the actual cultural responsiveness resource guide that we're talking about today. The overall goal of this effort was to build upon prior work, some of what Jennifer just mentioned, and beyond, and create a guide with links to easily accessible resources that programs like yours can use to become more responsive to the needs of the increasingly diverse population served in different communities across the country. If you haven't already seen the guide, we've included a link at the bottom of the slide. I also want to make sure and acknowledge my co-authors on the guide, Carrie Hofer, Aaron Baumgardner, and Danielle Taylor, as well as the other Hispanic Center and app colleagues who help provide input into the final product. The resource guide identifies 7 key components that are critical to providing culturally responsive programs and practices. And you'll see them listed here in this diagram. Defining and understanding cultural competency, choosing interventions, conducting a needs assessment, measurement considerations, collaboration, workforce diversity, and of course, budgeting. For each of these 7 key components, which I'll talk about in a minute, the guide provides a brief overview and then includes tables with links to easily accessible resources. These resources can be used to develop or improve your program's ability to provide services that are responsive to the unique needs of culturally and linguistically diverse populations in your community. We didn't want to reinvent the wheel, so this guide harnesses a wide range of currently available resources into a single one-stop shopping guide. Let's start with the fundamental question of what is cultural competency? Of course, this could be a long conversation, but there are many different definitions of cultural competency out there. Many focus on the behaviors, attitudes, and organizational policies that enable programs to work effectively in cross-cultural situations. In other words, do you understand the unique characteristics and needs of the culturally and linguistically diverse populations within your community? Are you and your staff and program services fully responsive to these needs? For example, do you speak their language? Do you understand their cultural values and beliefs, etc.? Overall, there seems to be 3 common dimensions of cultural competency that have emerged from research in this area. Number 1, critical awareness or one's own knowledge and biases regarding culturally diverse populations. Number 2, effective communication and interpersonal skills that foster strong relationships and trust with individuals from diverse backgrounds. And 3, organizational systems and policies that support practices that are responsive to the needs of diverse families. Many definitions also stress the importance of cultural competency at all levels of an organization, from the individual staff level to the program level, and extending to the overarching organizational policies and practices level. In other words, it's everyone's business. So let's talk about these a little bit more. Once you've identified a definition of cultural competency that fits best with your organization, the next challenge is to select or develop the most responsive intervention for the targeted population in your community. Given the strong emphasis these days on evidence-based practice, it's important to consider not only whether a particular intervention has been shown to be effective through prior research, but also has it been shown to be effective for populations similar to the diverse population your program serves. In other words, for whom is a program effective? Important question there. The resource guide includes links to various resources that review the research evidence of different interventions. When there's limited research on prior use and the effectiveness of interventions with diverse populations, you can use the guide to find resources that help you determine whether you may want to undertake the cultural and/or linguistic adaptation of an existing program, or even opt for developing an entirely new intervention. One of the most basic means of adapting an intervention is by translating materials. The guide includes resources that explain some of the recommended processes for high-quality translations, including such things as the use of multiple translators representing various regional or dialectical differences, examination of the appropriate literacy levels of the intended recipients, soliciting input from individuals for whom the translation is intended, and other similar strategies. Finally, when an existing intervention was developed for a particular population, it might be necessary to make cultural adaptations to that intervention. The guide includes, and this goes beyond just linguistic translations, the guide includes links to a range of resources describing some of the research-based adaptation models or approaches that to best meet the needs of culturally and linguistically diverse populations. Okay, so you started identifying an intervention program that meets the needs of the population you intend to serve, but at the same time, it's also important to conduct a needs assessment to guide your overall planning and further ensure that you're meeting the needs of the community. Kind of a double check. So a needs assessment involves a systematic gathering of information about a community's needs from families, community members, cultural brokers, and other key stakeholders. Organizations often find that working closely and collaboratively with community members to conduct a needs assessment is an important way to best understand the needs and issues related to the successful implementation of new programs. We often think of two types of needs assessments, either using internal data and or accessing external data. An internal needs assessment focuses inward, collecting data directly from the community and its population subgroups. This typically leads to the development of an action plan that considers not only the key needs identified, but also whether your program's current and future capabilities and resources can meet them. For example, I was recently working with a program that conducted a needs assessment and determined that there was a particular need for culturally responsive health services for low-income Hispanic mothers of newborn babies in the community. So on the other hand, accessing and existing publicly available data can be another important way to conduct a needs assessment for a diverse community. This type of needs assessment looks at currently available data, including administrative data or census data on the characteristics of the community and or community members. For example, a community may look at the current availability of the supply of publicly funded early care and education programs within high Hispanic neighborhoods to help guide decisions about possible expansions of capacity within those very communities. So you've selected an intervention and conducted a needs assessment. Before you start patting yourself on the back, you're now thinking ahead about how you'll want to document your service delivery efforts and determine whether you've been successful in improving the outcomes for the children and families served. The resource guide describes 4 aspects of measurement that you want to pay careful attention to when assessing outcomes for diverse populations. First, cultural and linguistic appropriateness. Well, was a measure developed with the cultural and linguistic diversity of the population taken into consideration? For example, does it take into account different regional or dialectical differences in the language of the population? Second, the measure's technical construction. Was it tested for use with diverse populations, and does it function well? Just translating a measure isn't enough, as it has been shown to work in the way intended. 3, sensitivity to detecting change over time and change in response to interventions. You want to be sure that the measures are sensitive enough to capture change in the outcomes that you're intending to improve. Otherwise, why measure? And then 4th, specific training and administration requirements for different measures and measurement approaches. You don't want to leave this one out. In other words, can the measure be used by your program staff in the intended way, and what's involved in doing so? Okay, so you've got a lot of basic building blocks in place, but now you want to make sure that you'll be able to successfully implement the new intervention. This is where collaboration comes into the picture. Collaboration with individuals or other organizations, particularly those with complementary areas of expertise to those of your own organization, can help your program be culturally responsive to the needs of the communities in which you work. We all know that any one organization can't do everything, especially smaller community-based organizations. So it's better to think about how to leverage your respective areas of strength or specialized skills in ways that maximize your responsiveness to the needs of the diverse population within your community. In other words, what do you do well, and what might another organization do well that would complement your organization's strengths? For example, a small community-based organization with experience serving Hispanic families might choose to develop a collaborative partnership with a research organization to strengthen their respective efforts. In this example, the community-based organization could draw upon the technical expertise of the research organization for support with activities such as conducting a needs assessment or an evaluation of the effectiveness of their program services on the targeted child and family outcomes of interest. While I could argue for the importance of all the areas discussed so far, perhaps one of the most critical components has to do with the relevant staffing of your organization. In order to deliver culturally competent services to increasingly diverse populations, your program may need to take a very careful look at whether you have the appropriate workforce to successfully serve the population within your community. In particular, you may need to determine whether it would help hire staff who are bicultural and or bilingual in the languages that correspond to the populations you serve. However, just hiring any bilingual and bicultural staff may not be a guarantee of success. as it's still important for any and all staff to demonstrate cultural competency in how they provide services, regardless of their background. To accomplish this goal, it's often important for programs to develop a specific plan to recruit, train, and retain diverse staff who have familiarity with the culture and language of the targeted community, as well as demonstrated prior experience serving the specific target population of interest. Finally, attention may need to be paid to ensuring that your organization has an overall strategic plan, as well as appropriate policies and initiatives that demonstrate a true commitment to serving the specific target population. Finally, we can't lose sight of the fact that it takes resources to develop culturally competent programs. All the topics addressed in the resource guide have budget implications for organizations like yours who are seeking to respond to the needs of diverse populations within communities. There typically are costs associated with things like staffing, training, programmatic resources and materials, as well as other activities related to ensuring cultural responsiveness. This last category of other related costs of accommodations might include costs associated with things like cultural and linguistic competence modifications of services, such as the use of cultural brokers, translation or interpreter services at meetings, home visits, and other instances. So this is just a quick glimpse of the 7 key areas of cultural responsiveness covered by the new resource guide. There's lots more included in the actual guide, and we really would like to encourage you to make the most out of this valuable new resource as you all strive to provide the most culturally and linguistically responsive services to the populations within your community. We'd now like to turn our attention to what I consider the exciting part, the panel discussion of today's presentation. As Lena had mentioned earlier, we're thrilled to have 3 of our colleagues who represent 3 distinct but complementary perspectives on the importance of cultural responsiveness of programs and policies. Welcome to our panelists, Suzanne, Deborah, and Matthew. We're excited that you all agreed to be part of the presentation. I guess I need to turn mine on too here, right? Okay, I think so we decided that we wanted to really get the input from our different panelists. So I'm going to throw out the first question. In this era of evidence-based accountability, what do you see as the biggest challenge to ensuring culturally responsive programs or policies for the increasingly diverse populations served? Matt, how about if you want to start on this one?
Yeah, thanks, Mike, and thanks again for the opportunity to be on the webinar today, and thank you to everyone in attendance. I greatly appreciate the work you all do. Just briefly on my organization at the National Conference of State Legislatures, we advise all 7,383 lawmakers and the thousands of legislative staff around the country on just the best research out there. We are a convener. We help those folks collaborate to really get them working together and understand what's going on across the states. And we also provide them a strong, cohesive voice in DC as well on federal policy. So just to get to your question, Mike, in my work with state lawmakers, I think one of the biggest challenges is just really helping them to develop a better understanding of this concept and really getting at a shared definition and an accurate definition, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions or even an idea that some folks might not be amenable to this kind of topic, and depending on you know, their own personal biases or experiences. So what I wanted to answer with is that just how we can educate our folks here at NCSL, lawmakers included, on moving them into a space where they can really help build legislation around this, how they can effectively draft this legislation, build consensus, and working these bills through the legislative process, I feel like is a potential challenge, mostly based on that there's not a strong background knowledge of this concept, and that it might be kind of difficult to really craft legislation that could really build in a strong measurement component to hold the folks accountable. I do want to say, though, that all policymakers are definitely interested in evidence-based, you know, programming and policies to support those. but they may need to start considering how these programs match up with the people they're intended to serve, as you mentioned. I think that's one area that I'm really trying to help folks understand. And just to reference some of the rapid expansion of English learner population in the Southeast, some states like Kentucky have seen almost 300 to 400% growth. So some of the lawmakers in those areas will have to start considering not only which interventions are best, but also how they're aligning with the changing demographics and aligning this concept of cultural responsiveness within those programs and really helping build that into policy. I'll leave it right there. I think someone else wanted to take that one too.
So Matt, I just want to, and maybe not push you, but the group as a whole, because I've seen at the federal level there's been a huge emphasis on this evidence-based accountability, and yet there's been so little discussion about the linkage to changing demographics of the population. Maybe Suzanne or Deborah, maybe you can touch upon that as well, because we're seeing a lot more, and Matt brings the state perspective, since there's an increasing emphasis on the state's roles in some of these issues. But Suzanne or Deborah? Oh, we can't hear Suzanne.
Suzanne, you may be muted.
Sorry about that. For me, when I think about evidence-based accountability, I think about the tools that we're using to measure the progress that folks are making, or the success of the program itself. And so I think that there is a real lack of valid and reliable tools that can be used for diverse populations that represent the language that they speak. I think if somebody has been around Head Start for a long time, back in 2004, there was an NRS achievement test that Head Start tried to implement, and I remember language on that. There were references that low-income migrant children in our program had no idea what those words meant. So fortunately, that tool was discontinued, but I also think that the lack of trained bilingual staff to administer those tools is an issue for a lot of programs. And I think a more current example would be the class assessment tool that's used to score Head Start programs and the interaction between teacher and children, and whether we're implementing that assessment internally, or if the Office of Head Start sends somebody in. If you're in a classroom that has multiple languages and the assessor doesn't speak those languages, then it's difficult to appropriately evaluate the interactions between the child and the teacher. So that, from a program side, are a couple of examples.
And you could get me going on and on about that whole issue about measurement, as some people know. And Suzanne, you're a little soft to hear, so maybe you might want to speak up when you talk.
Okay. Okay.
And before we go to the next question, I just want to clarify a question that we've gotten throughout the discussion so far, which is that the guide will be, and the webinar, the guide is currently available on our website, and we will share with that through the chat box, and the webinar itself will be available next week, and we'll be sending the link to all of you who both registered as well as that are attending.
Great, thanks. So let's go to our second question. How have any of you used data to conduct a needs assessment to guide decision making, or successfully get funding support for culturally responsive services in the communities in which you work? Suzanne or Deborah, you want to start? Suzanne?
Yeah, in terms of decision making, an example that came to mind when I was thinking about this question is that our agency has a long-standing policy of requiring bilingual staff in positions that interact with customers whose language is other than English. And we've had supervisors who challenge that at times when they try to show us their demographics of the clients that they're actually serving. And we have to turn around and use the data from our needs assessment of a broader community to say that that's great, those are the families that you are serving, but it doesn't reflect the demographics of the broader community. And lo and behold, when a bilingual staff person is hired, especially somebody who comes from that targeted population, the internal demographics begin to change and reflect that broader community data. And so we continue to use that in decision making where we need bilingual staff. But let me just add that I think there's a caveat that it's difficult to count or assess invisible populations. So undocumented immigrants, that sort of thing, are really difficult when there's a lack of trust. Or for us, we serve a lot of migrant farm worker populations, and the definitions across the different departments really differ. So, Department of Education has one definition, Office of Head Start has a different definition, Department of Labor, Agriculture, all of that. So there are some complexities, I think, that go into making a really good needs assessment.
Well, and that does make it hard. Having Suzanne and I collaborated together on the big national migrant seasonal Head Start study, but the fact that there are different definitions in some of these different programs, or even with the other programs, different definitions across states in some of the same programs, or different eligibility criteria, makes it a little more challenging when you're trying to do a needs assessment to understand who's in your community and what those needs are. Deborah, do you all struggle with some of this in providing support through the TNTA system in dealing with, as programs are looking to do needs assessments, and more and more programs are trying to take on this kind of work?
Yes, we absolutely do. And I'm just really excited to share one of the reports that we've been discussing in our external work group that Jennifer Amaya Thompson had mentioned earlier in the webinar, is the American Indian and Alaskan Native FACES, the Family and Child Experiences Survey data that has just finally been released. And so, that of course, it is the population that we have had limited data on. The FACES study has been around for the past 20 years, and this is the first year with, funding through OPRE and work through the tribal research, Tribal Early Childhood Research Center, that now we have data on a representative sample of AIAN programs, and we are using that data to better provide support through our TAT and TA services, as well as our resource development. So that's something we're really excited about.
That's great. That's great. No, that's going to be valuable information. I know it's been a long time in coming, so congratulations on that. Let's go to our next question, because this is one, as I mentioned when I was talking about the resource guide areas, staffing, it's related to the staffing one. It's one that I know lots of programs struggle with. Workforce diversity is a topic that comes up pretty frequently. What challenges have you encountered? And you all represent three different very, very important perspectives. What challenges have you all encountered with the recruitment, professional development, and retention of culturally and linguistically diverse staff? And how have you managed to overcome some of those challenges? Suzanne, I know when we talked before, you had mentioned some really interesting issues that deal with both recruitment of really qualified staff, and then some of the retention issues that you've had to struggle with.
Yeah, and I don't think that our issues are unique to our agency. I think we're hearing it in a lot of programs, but since we primarily
still a little hard to hear you, Suzanne.
All right, sorry. Since we're primarily in rural communities, recruiting degreed bilingual staff is just an ongoing challenge for us. And in some cases, we've had to grow our own staff and spend a lot of money on education and development of staff, which can be a really long and expensive process. But in this past year, we've even resorted to recruiting in Puerto Rico to bring bilingual staff up to work with us, which I think when you're talking about then culturally appropriate staff, then we have to make sure that they understand migrant and seasonal farm workers versus just Latino population in general. And it also, for us, brings a budget issue that we've had to spend money on relocation support for those staff. We've struggled to identify the best way to assess language when we're doing the hiring. And we realized that while some of the applicants may have Spanish, or in some of our locations we need Creole, their English may not be really adequate. So it comes down to deciding what kind of things can you compromise on. And I think finally, my other point would be that we know that we need to budget for additional staff who speak the language. So maybe we can't find a degreed bilingual staff person, but we can hire a degreed teacher and have bilingual support staff who get trained to support that teacher and do translation. And that translation would be more than just oral translation. It's also for, proper translation of marketing materials, staff policies, staff and customer training, corporate systems that support staff who have English as a second language. So there's a lot of layers of costs that I think are not always taken into consideration.
So, just a follow-up question. It's not always obvious to many folks that the strategy that your organization has developed requires quite a considerable investment of resources. And it's more of the long-term thinking versus the short-term thinking, because I've seen again and again places where the folks are frustrated with, well, we can't find staff, we can't hire staff, we lose staff. And I think that, and maybe you're just used to it because you're so good at it, but the fact that you're investing up front in a lot of these strategies for how you're identifying, how you're recruiting, and what you're doing to retain staff, those are all some very forward-looking investments of resources up front, because it's going to pay off in cost savings down the road in terms of getting quality staff and keeping the quality staff. What led to that decision of, like, we have to invest the money now because there's no shortcut to the process?
A little bit of desperation, really needing to meet the requirements and not being able to recruit in our local communities forced us to look outside the box. And let me say that I still think that we have retention issues, particularly with our shorter season programs where bilingual qualified degree teachers are in high demand, so they're going to leave to work in a year-round position where they can. So it continues to be a challenge for us.
Great. Deborah or Matt, especially Deborah, I know that, in the supports that you guys provide from the TNTA perspective, this is, again, an issue, but also, Matt, I'd love to hear any thoughts that you've seen from the policy perspective.
Yeah, I can talk to kind of the pre-K through 12 education realm. Lawmakers across the country are facing teacher shortages in general education classrooms, so really focusing their efforts on a specific subpopulation of that has become really challenging. One thing I wanted to highlight, though, from New America, which is in DC, they did a case study on Highline Public Schools in Oregon, where they have a grow your own bilingual teacher kind of pipeline, where they're taking paraprofessionals and transitioning them into head teacher roles. And from my perspective and working with lawmakers, I think this is there's multiple ways to frame this. You can look at it from, the cost savings of not having to hire from out of state, out of country even, but also how the research supports, having the same race and ethnicity educator as those students. It's incredibly beneficial. So those are some of the concerns and things that are happening kind of from my standpoint right now.
Great. I'm sure Connor Williams will love to hear the shout out to his DLL worker, because there is some really, really great stuff that they've done in terms of highlighting some of these examples that add to this kind of discussion. Deborah, do you have, you want to address any of this on the diversity side from a TNTA point of view?
Well, I'll just share a quick report too that we've been discussing at our work group, and it's a report that came out through the Migration Policy Institute, and they developed a report on addressing the needs of not only the diverse children that are served, but also a diverse workforce through quality rating and improvement systems. So it's, strategies through the QRIS that we have been looking at and discussing and trying to incorporate in our work. So.
And that's a really important area, because I think the whole area of QRIS systems across states hasn't really addressed the issues of diversity, both in terms of how things are getting assessed, assessing the classroom quality with the diversity lens, and or the staffing as you're mentioning. So I'm glad you brought that up. For our next question, what have been the toughest challenges? I know there's probably lots of different challenges, so you might have to narrow down to those that are more challenging than others. The toughest challenge you face in helping your organization or others you work with, because I don't want you to throw your colleagues under the bus, because you'll have to deal with that later. But to help folks become more culturally competent, how has or could the resource guide be used to address these challenges? So I'll throw it out. Deborah, maybe you can start. And I won't tell you if you throw them under the bus.
Just as Lena had introduced me in the beginning, a little reminder for everyone, my responsibility here at the National Center for Early Childhood Development, Teaching and Learning is really to ensure that all of the resources that are produced are authentically and respectfully represent all the populations that we serve. And so in doing this, I often ask myself, how can we make sure that all of the materials and key messages are equitable and relevant to all of our audiences? And so the biggest challenge that I see is that all of the staff who work at the center, right, at all of our centers, all of the individuals, process information based on their own experiences and based on their own cultural backgrounds, which of course shape our beliefs and our values. And so it's really important then for all of us to come together and engage in conversations to develop these shared understandings, right? And so when we think about this wonderful resource guide that you all have been able to produce, it came very much in handy in our work group discussions as we began to have conversations around really heavy topics, including equity and race. And so one of the components of the guide that you had mentioned, Michael, was defining and understanding cultural competence. And of course, there are tables with resources for each of those components of the guide. And so one of the resources in the guide was from the Annie E. Casey Foundation. And so we used that as a starting point. So there was this definition on race that we took from that resource, and we used it as our starting point for conversation. And as we had conversations about it, we adapted that original definition and made it more sensitive to the tribal communities that we serve, and also added a definition to it so that it would be more practical for data collection purposes, for example. So that's one way that we have used the guide.
Great, great. Suzanne, Matt?
Yeah, I think that the resources in the guide are a really great way to, like Deborah said, to start bringing that topic into discussions and training, and helping folks to see all of the different areas that need to be addressed, not just the initial piece, but in order to really be successful in doing a diverse program, being able to consider things like the HR and the budget and all of that.
Yeah, I'd add that the guide really gives a great definition of cultural competency, and kind of helps, from my perspective, helps my folks think about how all these things are, what they look like and what they are. And we'll get into this in the next question, I think, but it's something that we're really just starting to do here. In my short experience at NCSL, these things aren't generally prioritized, and in lawmaking, they kind of just fall by the wayside and are, in implementation, they become challenges, and our folks wonder why certain things don't work the way they designed them to. Well, this is part of that answer. So I'll turn it back over to you, Mike.
Great, thanks. Well, and I know for me, from as a researcher, one of the frustrations that I've had, and which is why I was so excited about doing this effort in the first place, was the fact that issues of cultural and linguistic diversity are, in some ways, they're often missing from many research conversations. there's been an increasing emphasis on the rigor of our science, the rigor of our work. And I'm always the one in the room having that conversation, raising the question of, okay, we can have the most rigorously designed studies, but if we're not conceptualizing the interventions well with diversity in mind, if we're not basing it on evidence from interventions and programs with diverse populations, measures, and I've even written a book on measures. I never thought I'd be doing measurement work. If we're not using the right measures, if we're not thinking about how these measures are functioning, if we're not analyzing the data in the right ways to understand these issues, then we're doing a disservice, and we've thrown rigor out the window. And so that, for me, has been, as a researcher, been one of the biggest challenges, and why I think this is such an important conversation to have, an important set of resources. Let's go to our fifth question. We often talk about challenges and limitations, but here's a chance to really talk about the other side of the equation. So if you have to think about what would be the one effort that you're most proud of with respect to your organization's efforts to improve the cultural competency of services or policies. Deborah, you want to start off with?
Sure,
you just mentioned some of the things, but.
Yeah, so what I'd have to say that I'm really most proud of is that culturally and linguistically responsive practices have moved away from being an add-on and really are intentionally integrated within all of our resource development and training and technical assistance activities. And so from the very beginning of conceptualization of a product to the final production, we have a plan in place to ensure that the staff, the children, the families, that are as culturally diverse and ethnically diverse are all honored and included in all of our resources. And in doing this, we are really trying to mirror the intent behind the Head Start program performance standards, which integrate language and culture throughout. So,
Suzanne, that's great. Suzanne, how?
I think that an example for me is it's a small program for us, but in this past year, we were finally able to implement a youth program that was able to be used to help Department of Labor, the public schools, and in particular tobacco companies really understand the needs of farm worker families and why children are working in the field along with their families to contribute to the economic support of the families. The intent was to get youth out of the fields because of the high risk in tobacco work for sickness by exposure to the tobacco plants. And there was talk about, well, why can't you just get them out? And we had to really work through a process to help them understand why those families had children in the field with them, and then really get them to provide the funding to support the type of program design and intervention that was needed to break that cycle of children working in the field. So that was pretty exciting for us, and we're hoping to expand that this next summer.
Great. Exciting. And Matt, did you?
Yeah, we just received a 2-year grant project from the Kellogg Foundation to focus on equipping and educating legislators around the opportunity gap and issues of equity in early childhood education. And I don't think you can really have that conversation without talking about race, without talking about cultural competence. So what we're trying to do is develop resources for lawmakers to really understand these definitions, understand some innovation across the states, some legislative examples of states that are really moving the bar and closing those gaps. So we'll be developing a few policy briefs around this. We have a meeting in Seattle next month where we're bringing a group of about 25 lawmakers together to really learn from this, learn from the experts in these fields, and really try to package together some action plans and really get them collaborating and thinking, with their colleagues across the country. So I think as an organization, this is a really good step for us to address this issue.
That's really exciting because I think it's needed at many different levels, but especially at the state level, state policy level, because you often don't see the attention to those issues. So I think that's really exciting to see that going on. We wanted to turn now to a couple of the questions that have come in from our participants. And so remember, if you do have some questions that you'd like to submit, just please use the question in the chat box to submit them. But we have a couple of questions, and I do want to reiterate something that Lena had mentioned earlier on, that we're talking today on this particular webinar, we're talking about cultural and linguistic diversity, but I think a lot of this has to do with, as Lena said, a lot of this has to do with diversity of many different perspectives. So there's lots of ways that you can conceptualize diversity, and it's not just around cultural and linguistic diversity. So just want to say that there, we've just narrowed it down for the purposes of the resource guide and for today's conversation, but it does relate to a broader set of diversity issues. So one of the questions that came in, and we kind of touched upon this a little bit in Suzanne, in one of your responses, but for all three of you, how are you making some of this work budget-wise? Because again, as I mentioned when I was talking about the resource guide, it costs money to do this. And Suzanne, you talked nicely about, just from a staffing point of view, the level of investment that you all do up front to ensure that you get the right hiring, the right recruitment strategies. But there's a lot of issues around developing materials, resources. If you're running a Head Start program, it goes from, gee, do you have books in English to do you have books and materials in Spanish, and you mentioned Creole and all the other language groups that you serve. So how do you all make this work?
Yeah, I think I wonder that every day. We just have to make choices, and they're not always easy or the best choices in how we fund our programs. And we advocate with our funders all the time. The example with the tobacco companies saying, oh, you can do that for a small amount of money, and we're saying no, in order to be a successful program designed to meet the needs of this particular population, it needs to be fully funded. And I think sticking up for that. And in some cases, we've had to reduce our enrollment to get the funding to do all the things that we need.
So you have to take from one side to feed the other. So Deborah, Matt, I mean, I don't want to put you too much on the spot, but from the funding point of view, you probably are closer to the funding perspective from when policymakers pass some legislation and they decide to invest in something. Far too often, whether it's at the state level or the federal level, it's how can we do more with less? But as we're talking about here, it costs more money. So you're dealing with not the same metrics of, okay, I've got X number of kids in an early childhood program or in a youth program, not just, but once you add in diversity, you start talking about additional costs. But there tends to not be any additional premium for bilingual, bicultural staff or resources or materials. How does that get into kind of some of these policy discussions?
Great question. I do think, state lawmakers operate on mostly a 2-year cycle, so they really have to prioritize what they're, spending their money on. And I think a bigger theme from this discussion for me personally has been just these things are more of system changes and systemic kind of approaches that we need to start thinking about when we develop budgets. If we're expecting a bill to be implemented the way it's designed, we need to include all populations and really be culturally competent in how those kind of manifest on the ground. So I'm not sure I'm completely answering your question, but I do think this will start to become more part of the conversation, I think, and especially with the work we're doing with the Kellogg Foundation, that this will start becoming more of a consideration. I do think it's going to need to take a little bit of evidence, and I think getting this more transparent connection between what it means to be culturally competent and enact that and live that and how that plays out in outcomes, and really getting those numbers to our folks is one way that I can see this kind of potentially evolving. So
actually, just a follow-up to that, because another question that came in was really to you, Matt, but I think it really can kind of go to others as well from the other side of it. And that is, it's like, how do you prove to funders or policymakers that there's value in investing in this in terms of a longer term strategy? Because I think of one of the briefs that we just recently did as part of the Hispanic Center, where we found these unusually high rates of EC utilization by Hispanics in Chicago. And there was a lot of discussion about why would Chicago stand out so much. And there were a lot of policy discussions. It wasn't causal, but it was really looking at the policy context within Illinois, the state of Illinois and the city of Chicago, that's very pro-immigrant, that's very bilingual preschool, one of the few states in the country that has bilingual preschool legislation mandating providing services in other languages. And so how do we think about proving these kinds of, getting the information to really demonstrate to funders that this matters, funders and policymakers?
That's a great question as well. I do think having that conversation on what policies are out there that kind of might help these things come to light is always important. When we really try to highlight research-based policies, innovative policies around the country, we do have to keep in mind that we have to keep the best interest of all states and local lawmakers across a bipartisan spectrum. So we have to be kind of careful in how we talk about this. But in my personal experience, having conferences where we have folks who are on the ground and giving anecdotal evidence of these things really helps to start to sway people's perception and hopefully change their minds and attitudes and behaviors down the line.
Suzanne or Deborah, quick comment?
Oh.
I'm good.
Well, that's fine. So I know that we're down to just a couple minutes, and I wanted to kind of close with just a summary of some of the key themes. And I want to also remind folks that we will have this information. We will have the slides that we included. We have a link to the resource guide. We'll send that out afterwards, including some of the additional questions that people that came in and trying to respond to those. But there were a couple of key themes that I'd like to just reiterate. One is that there's a lot of resources out there, and there's a lot to build from. So even though we may not have all the interventions that have been shown to be effective with diverse populations, there's a lot to start with, and there's a lot of ways in which you should expect to be flexible and to adapt. That this whole, as I think both Suzanne and Deborah kind of nicely pointed out, it should be seen as an iterative process, in that you're not going to get there overnight. You're going to have to do some stepwise work to build on the existing resources that you have. And then the last thing is really that in order to be successful, in order to get to where, and Suzanne, I think your process is described just around the workforce issues, didn't happen overnight, I'm sure. And it has to be intentional. So there has to be some clear intentionality and a commitment to, with this end goal of trying to be as responsive as possible to the increasingly diverse populations, because that's the reality today. It's no longer, and I think, Deborah, you might have mentioned something like this. The one thing I keep stressing to people is that the demographics of the population that are served by many of our programs, early childhood and other programs, is going to continue to evolve or continue to grow larger. It's not a subgroup analysis anymore. It's not a small subgroup side issue. It is becoming more and more of a primary focus. So I want to thank our panel, our three panelists, along with Jennifer from ACF, for participating in this, and all the participants. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to continuing these conversations. Thank you.
Thank you.
you.